How you going, guys? Daniel from Wholesale Automatics. Today we're going to fit a valve body in the RE4 transmission found in the Nissan Patrol 4-speeds. Let's get into it. Just a reminder, it's good to road test the vehicle before we put it on the hoist. Check it's all clear of codes, and also the road test will get the oil warm. All right, we're going to drain the transmission. Warm oil will always drain a lot easier. I'm going to start removing the bolts from the back of the transmission pan. This way it will hang the back of the transmission pan and we can drain more of the oil out of the pan. Now these four-speed transmissions have got a couple of brackets that hold the cooler pipes at the front. I've just got one last bolt at the front side. Slowly loosen this one off. Drain more out of the pan. Take the last bolt out. You can hang up a little bit on the front pipe, but a bit of tilting, it will come down. Next step, we'll remove the transmission filter. It's held in by 3 bolts, and we'll set these bolts aside from the rest of the bolts that hold the valve body in. Make sure the oil filter O-ring has come out of the valve body. Next part, we'll remove the wiring. The little clips are very brittle. Sometimes they break very easily. This transmission must have been built in the past before, because the clips are already broken. Just pull the wires out of these little retainers. I'm going to remove this clip that holds up the solenoid wiring here. This solenoid controls the lockup torque converter. And once again, the clip is already broken off. The last temperature sensor, you're going to push up on a little part of the clip so it can slide to the passenger side, and then it will fall out. The part of the clip that I was pushing up was just right here, and that part That part there tucks in that slot there. Now that we have all the wiring disconnected, we can just fold that out of the way. We can start removing the bolts that hold the valve body to the transmission. When removing all the bolts from the valve body, I set out the bolts on a tray to make sure that it's a lot easier to work out where the bolts go later on. In our instructions, we do state where the bolts go. There is 2 different size lengths. You can refer back to those instructions though. I'm just removing all the bolts that hold the valve body to the transmission. Most of the bolts are around the perimeter of the valve body. And some hold also pipe retaining clamps as well, like this one here. There's 2 bolts here with another pipe retainer. This one right here. Now I've left 2 bolts in, one here and one here, sort of on each side of the valve body. And now as you can see, it is loose, oil is draining. And we can remove these last 2. Now on top of this valve body there is springs that are for the accumulator. And they will most likely fall. That's the 3 springs there. Right, this is the valve body that we removed, and this is the one that we'll be fitting. These valve bodies for the RE4s, they come complete. There's nothing that you have to transfer over. There can be slight differences. It just depends on the age of the valve body itself. Some have bendable wiring retainers, and then some have got clips. These clips can break, but the main part of the valve body, they're all the same. All the solenoids on the new ones, these 4 solenoids are all brand new. We replace them on all of our RE4 transmissions because they are known to cause faults. Now let's fit the reconditioned valve body. Now, before we fit the valve body, I want to explain these accumulator springs. Now, the blue spring is what we supply in the kit. It's a little bit firmer than the original. That one will sit on the front. The large one will be in that position, and the medium one is in that position. Now, in the transmission itself, you can't mix them up if you start with the largest one first. Now the holes of the accumulator starts off obviously large, and that one can't fit into the accumulator on the other accumulators. So large ones in that position, medium ones in the back, and the skinnier one that we supply in the kit, which is the blue one, goes in the front. Now, if you've got any Vaseline handy, the Vaseline is fine for transmissions. It will just melt into the oil. I glue the springs onto the valve body. Just like so. It helps due to we only have 2 hands. When we're lifting the valve body up, we also have to align the manual valve, which is controlled by the T-bar lever. There's a slot, and that has to line up with a pin up here. Get a couple of bolts ready so you know where they're going. We just get those 2 bolts up top to finger tight, then we can start the rest of the bolts. All right, now that we've got all the bolts started, I run around, just get them touching, and then we can torque them up. Right, we're going to torque all the bolts up to 8 Newton meters. That's roughly 70 inch-pounds. Right, now that those bolts are torqued up, we'll bring the wiring back in. There is one bolt that I've left out that actually holds the one of the heat temperature sensors. Just fold these metal tabs around it. And with this temp sensor, you feed it in between there first, just a touch. And then this side of the switch has to be slid into the bracket there. This clips in there. The last bolt that I was talking about goes into here. It's touching, and then once again torque it up. Next part, we'll clip in the lock-up solenoid. And refit the metal clip retainer. Just like so. The last 2 plugs. You've got these plugs are color coded. There's an orangey brown and a grey, and the plugs on the valve body are the same colors. Now, if your clips are broken, I've never actually seen them fall out. If you like, you can cable tie them up. What you could do, you can just loop it through the bracket that they clip onto. Now you can get new internal looms that we actually have in stock if you do prefer to have new clips. Just make sure your wiring's all nice and neat, tucking out of the way. All right, we've got our new oil filter. We've got to put a little bit of Vaseline or transmission oil on the O-ring itself. A little bit of upward push and the O-ring will sit into the valve body. Now we get the 4 long bolts that we set aside for the filter. Get the bolts touching and then we'll torque them up. And we'll torque these filter bolts up to 8 Newton meters or 70 inch-pounds. Next, we'll just wipe down the surface for the transmission pan. Depending on what gasket you had, sometimes the gasket can be stuck on the transmission. A little bit of scraping with a small razor blade might be needed. The gasket that we supply in the valve body kit is the surfaces need to be dry and no oil at all. If you do get the gasket soaked in oil, the gasket will just split, so just be mindful of that one. Next part, we have to have cleaned the transmission pan. You can use that with degreaser, and then air dry it. We'll also clean down the magnet as well. Setting the new gasket on it. Now this gasket can be a bit tedious since it's so thin. Get a bolt ready. Tuck the front of the pan on top of the cooler pipe. And with one hand holding the pan up, start fitting some bolts. As you're putting the bolts in, make sure that the gasket is still in its place. It can get folded in. Just start all the bolts one at a time as we go around. Now the front two side bolts hold the retaining brackets for the cooler pipe. I've just noticed the gasket at the back of the pan is a little bit out of align. I've just loosened the bolts off a tiny bit just so I can get the bolt through the gasket. Now that they're all in, I'll go around and just get the bolts touching the pan, and then we can torque them to spec. Now we're going to torque the pan bolts up to 7 Newton meters. One more final loop to make sure you've tightened them all. Also with these gaskets, after they've been tightened once, the gasket squishes a bit and they need to be just nipped up a tiny little bit more to get back to tension. Next part, we're going to refit the drain plug. The washers are generally good to reuse. If you like, you can change them. Fit the sump plug. And then we're just going to torque it to 25 Newton meters. Just like so. And don't forget to refit the cooler pipe retainers. All right, next step is we'll drop the vehicle back on the ground and fill the transmission through the dipstick, run it through the gears and then recheck the oil level a couple of times. Then we'll road test it. Once after the road test, we'll recheck the oil level again. All right, now that we've dropped the vehicle down on the ground, we'll fill it up. They'll generally take 7 to 8 litres. So make sure you have at least 10 litres handy and we'll get going. Now I've filled it up with probably around 4.5 litres. Right now I'll start it and then we'll run it for the next part and then continue to fill it. Now these dipsticks are very difficult to read. Usually you have to do it 3 or 4 times just to make sure that you've got the oil in the right spot. Now the oil has to be in between those 2 grooves. Oil will most likely sit on the sides above those grooves because it's touching the side of the tube as you're pulling it in and out of the transmission. So what you're looking for is oil in that groove section. One side is hot as well. Now that we've got sufficient amount of oil, we'll road test it and recheck it after the road test. All right, now that we've road tested the vehicle, the oil has gone down a tiny little bit, so we're going to add another probably half a litre and then it should be done. Now it's up to the hot mark. And there you have it. That's how you fit the valve body for the RE4 transmission. Thanks for watching.